After making Resident Evil 4 and having it hailed as basically the best game ever made, it was going to be a very tough act to follow. Resident Evil 5 never really stood a chance. The audience wanted more Resident Evil 4, and frankly, they got it, even if at the cost of Resident Evil 5 being shunned as stupid Resident Evil 4, in retrospect at least. Nearly every moment in Resident Evil 4, every area, every story beat, every boss is recreated in 5, but in kinda an over-the-top Michael Bay way. And it flavors the game kinda like the endless special effect works and spectacle from the Star Wars prequels. Bigger isn't always better. I don't necessarily say this to dismiss the game outright, but it's sorta hard not to be on a boat being chased by a giant fish, shooting it with miniguns and missile-launching turrets, and ask yourself if we really needed to do this again. Resident Evil 5 does its best to distinguish itself in small ways, most notably in the inclusion of co-op, which is not only a feature, but pretty much the intended experience, as single player will have you babysitting an AI co-op partner, and the co-op is surprisingly well incorporated and deliberate. On the surface, the inventory returning to the old system of having 9 inflexible slots seems like a bizarre downgrade, but it actually leads to some surprisingly thoughtful management puzzles by co-managing an 18-slot inventory. Resident Evil 5 also pioneered some new technology in games, primarily in using motion capture for human character performances, which also allowed the use of virtual camera movements within the game, which gives this game some pretty good cinematography, a piece of tech that was initially developed for James Cameron's Avatar that would become extremely common in games following Resi 5, and which is used to pretty great effect throughout the game. Resident Evil 5 was initially released in 2009 for the Xbox 360 and PS3, with a PC port following a few months after. In 2010, Resident Evil 5 Gold Edition would release with its DLC included, which would serve as the basis for the 2015 Steam release, the 2016 PS4, Xbox One, and the Shield Android TV versions, I don't know what that is, and the 2019 Switch release. And Resident Evil 5 as a whole was, for many years, the best-selling Capcom game ever made until the release of Monster Hunter World. There also isn't a remake of Resident Evil 5 yet, and it doesn't seem like it'll be the next one, but I guess I'd be interested to see it. Resident Evil 5 features an interesting mix of the old and the new. In 2009, the game caught flack for feeling dated, as it takes a lot from Resident Evil 4 at a time where every game was doing that, but going a step further. In Uncharted, you can move and shoot, and jump wherever you want, and climb stuff freely, and take cover most anywhere. Same with Gears of War, Dark Sector, and about 1,000 more games. We'd gotten smoother, faster, and snappier. Nowadays, it more so receives flack for not being like Resi 4 enough. It's too actiony, ammo is not a concern ever. There are over-the-top finishing moves, there's like a level where you cover shoot against guys with guns. Also, the QuickTime events haven't gone anywhere, although they don't show up in co-op for whatever reason, which is nice. I appreciate it. Resident Evil 5 is an odd best and worst of both worlds. Shooting holds you still, but aiming is way more precise. The inventory is simplified from the reorganizing of the attaché case from 4, but that serves to turn co-op into a management puzzle of its own, and items in the cardinal slots can be quickly selected with a D-pad. Treasures can no longer be combined, and the only combinable items in the game are the green red herbs to increase their efficacy. There's no longer an RPG-like system where you can boost your own health with yellow herbs, but in return, the upgrade system is expanded to include upgradable special traits like critical hit chance for certain precision weapons, and the weapon selection is generally much broader, even if still falling in the same pattern of pistols, magnums, rifles, machine guns, explosive launchers, and grenades. Speaking on those guns, the selection is quite good. I love shotguns, and the Street Sweeper is a hell of a gun, whose range can be upgraded in the special slot, which fires fast and which shreds enemies, just completely tears them apart. The pistol can be upgraded to a comical 40-round magazine, maybe they're just really small bullets, and the grenade launcher has a variety of ammunition to make up for its lack of upgrades. Acid works better on flush, electric stuns enemies, setting you up for finishing moves, incendiary rounds hurt really bad, you get the idea. The co-op also makes weapon selection pretty interesting in the same way as Rainbow Six or any other good co-op game, which I gushed about a while back. Having a long-range ally as a close-range player is a godsend, but the long-range weapons tend to reload slowly, requiring a bodyguard for aggressive enemies, and on the note of enemies, the variety is pretty impressive too. There are a lot of standard Magini, the name for those infected with the Lost Plagas in this game, who start out with close-range weapons and occasionally chuck a bottle, and eventually climb up to guns and rocket launchers, but there are also a fresh variety of Plagas mini-bosses on display, like these mouth ones that need to be made vulnerable by shooting their tail, and which instantly down you if they get a bite off, and bat Plagas that take to the skies. Not only that, but it feels like every chapter has its own mini-boss, just for it, sometimes multiple, with some of them more recurring than others. Some Some fairly familiar, like the chainsaw guy and minigun guy, others completely new and terrifying, like the giant cockroach men that slowly march towards you for an instant kill, and need to be shot in their fleshy weak spots on their back, or one like the executioner, who only appears once and swings a buster axe around like it's nothing. We're not completely off track, I promise. My point is, this is an aggressive game. Enemies run around a lot, they're aggressive, they're varied, and dangerous. Standing in place to shoot isn't a mistake, it's a way to drag the game back into horror. There's an action streak in this game, there's QTEs to uppercut enemies, and you can combo these in co-op. Hell, you can take cover behind walls in certain sections. But when you're cornered by a chainsaw, stuck in place lining up a shot and hoping it puts you into a stun, it sure as hell still feels like a horror game. Or at least still maintains a lot of the tension from one. And I think that's a pretty good way to keep this game feeling like Resident Evil 4 despite the lack of some of the more overt horror aspects and the atmosphere. Some aspects have definitely fallen to the wayside, namely the puzzles and exploration. Puzzles have just outright left the equation in favor of being a Michael Bay action movie, and exploration, I mean there's a few broader areas here and there, especially towards the end, but the game is aggressively linear and does its best to keep the pace up by ushering you from set piece to set piece. It works for what the game is trying to be, but it would be nice if those elements stuck around a little more. Shooting feels really good. Ignoring the stand-in-place aiming, guns have a very visceral impact on enemies, the shotguns especially, although the early game guns do feel a little pathetic, especially the starter pistol, although I'd guess that's kind of the point. Outside of the campaign, Resi 5 features yet another return of the Mercenaries, plus its DLC expansion, the Mercenaries Reunion. While I'm not huge on horde modes, honestly, Resi 5's version of the Mercenaries is absolutely fantastic. The sheer variety of mini-bosses lets each of the maps feel very different, as does a solid variety of maps in general, from the town square towards the start of the game with executioners, to the mine crawling with insects. The cargo container can go die though. Chainsaws are so cancer in this game and they feel endless, but the free rocket launchers are a pretty cool touch. Mercenaries even has 2 wholly unique levels, not pulled from parts of the campaign, an extremely vertical lab filled with liquors, and a prison suspended in the middle of a volcano, which has a unique boss, the Red Executioner. They're like weird sex perverts, like a Silent Hill game. The broad selection of characters offers a lot of playstyles, more normal ones with default Chris and Sheva, funnier ones with Wesker and Jill, especially Super Shotgun Wesker, and I gotta give a special mention to Double Rocket Launcher Chris. Perhaps what makes the Mercenaries work best, of course, though, is co-op, which can muddy up the ammo drops a little, but adds so much in allowing the wackier builds to work as support for more normal ones. Sharing heals, swapping items on the fly, and the spawn points typically setting you on opposite ends of the map to start ends up creating incredibly exciting intros. It feels like Mercenaries was always meant to have co-op like this. I'm sure I wouldn't have loved it as much alone, but Resi 5, if nothing else, is a fantastic co-op game. Mercenaries Reunion unfortunately doesn't feature any new maps, and weirdly enough quarantines its map progress and scoring to its own little section, I guess just for the sake of fairness since the DLC characters are pretty crazy. The remasters from the PS4 and Xbox One and on do feature a new version of Mercenaries called Mercenaries United, which just combines the original Mercenaries and Reunion, so that's nice. There are 8 new characters, all of whom are wacky, overpowered, and fun. Minigun Chris can literally just hold the fire button indefinitely to shred anything and everything. It's functionally a cheat code. 4 of the 8 characters are more Chris and Sheva variants, but 2 minor characters, Josh and Excel from the story, are fleshed out, and Barry Burton and Rebecca Chambers, longtime fan favorites, return. Rebecca is quite fun as an advanced healer and shotgunner. Mercenary Reunions is essentially free at this point. The modern versions of Resident Evil 5 all include it for free, so it's a nice, wackier bonus on top of an already strong mode. Versus mode also exists, and I'm sure you could probably find someone in the Discord server to play it with. Games in this era were just mandated to have some kind of competitive online mode, both basically Mercenaries variants. Slayers and Team Slayers are 4 players aiming to get the best score in Mercenaries. I bet Team Slayers is quite fun, honestly. And Survivors and Team Survivors is that, but with BMing, as your main goal is to kill your opponents to prevent them from playing the game. Again, if you can find 4 people who are down, I'm sure it's a pretty good time, especially considering how wacky some characters get, but it is a shame that Versus was never expanded to include the Reunion characters. Anyway, I'll probably never play Versus, but cool stuff. Resi 5 suffers from some of the Xbox 360 era's visual quirks. It's very brown and gray and sometimes yellow, and Chris is very much the buzz-coated, beefy military white man of the time. There's kinda no escaping these elements in a shooter of the era. That said, there are a good number of upsides too. I think setting almost the entire game during the day is very unique for horror, and that the game still manages to be tense and even a little scary throughout is pretty cool. It helps that the enemies look so damn good. The tentacle worm things were just them showing off how many polygons they could use, but standard Magini have a solid number of variants too. Chainsaw guys all have the little details and how they freak out when injured and play dead at low health. The executioners get that huge screen shaking thud when they drop the axe. The tribal chiefs loom above even Chris and have this sort of intimidating unflinchingness about them. The variety is strong gameplay and visual wise. Speaking of variety, the fictional West African country of Kijuju has tons of it, while remaining grounded, naturalistic, and doing things that are at least kinda unique to the realities of West Africa. Oil refineries with pillars of flame blocking paths, rocky cliffsides, small villages with a surprising amount of interiors to go in and explore, a volcano, secret underground labs. There's never a chapter that's too similar to the last, and that's all on top of a constant flow of new mini-bosses, set pieces, and enemies. The game is certainly never boring with how fast it shotguns through new scenarios, reinventing itself in over-the-top ways with gigantic bosses and flashy moments. The music is fine. The game definitely leans cinematic as Resi 4 had before it, but it does have an occasional bit of flavor sprinkled in. The soundtrack is generally percussion heavy and has occasional vocals in, I assume, an African language that play to the setting. I would have liked to see them lean a little bit more into this flavor, but those little bits stand out well, and the more basic cinematic stuff works well enough all in all. As a result of its country-spanning nature and fast pace, the game isn't nearly as cleanly as divided as Resi 4, although the opening is notably similar. Chris and Sheva, his new teammate from the BSAA, arrive in Kijuju, in a small town that seems vaguely normal from a distance, but pretty quickly reveals itself to be infected, with natives beating people in the street, performing spectacle executions like a modern Doom game. Resident Evil Wiki, I think that's a bit, I'm not sure you should be asking if they're always like this. This game is already accused of being the racist one enough. The first chapter roughly could be called the Village, African version, as it does sort of act like a condensed version of the Resi 4 intro. Looping back to our protagonist briefly, there's not a whole ton going on. Chris has become Action Man and really wants to save his waifu Jill, who disappeared after an altercation with series villain Wesker, who is having fun with human experiments in Africa because he's a comically mustache-twirling villain. As for Sheva, she doesn't have a ton going on. She never appears in a game after this outside of like a single note in Resi 6 and like the gacha games or whatever, so never gets a chance to be anything more than backup Jill, who kinda acts as the voice of reason to the extent Chris lets her, and is the smaller character and therefore the one that gets thrown over gaps in the 3 or 4 spots where that mechanic ever gets used. I wish there was more to say. I like Sheva in the few moments she gets, but she's a character in a Michael Bay movie. The game's first action scene is a pretty overwhelming horde of Magini. They feel basically infinite and are probably meant as much to teach you that you can run away from an issue as much as it was to flex the larger number of enemy models and details that they could manage with the new hardware. The first chapter ends with the first mini-boss, the Executioner, who fairly uniquely is on a hard time limit, as Chris and Sheva hold out for evac. Weapons are limited to 2 unupgraded base pistols and a very shitty SMG, and while you don't necessarily need to kill him, the reward is worth the effort if you can manage it. There were some mini-bosses in 4 that you could run around and abandon, notably the Super Regenerator, I don't remember what it's called, but this one turns into a little DPS race. Also, the Executioner is pretty fun in general. He's very slow and lumbering, so not too difficult, but can smash through certain walls and obstacles, which is obviously a little technology flex, but this is somehow the only one in the main game. You never really get a proper fight with one if you don't play well and utilize the explosive barrels well, at least until Mercenaries. Most of the rest of the town plays out as an early action adventure game would. You get the shotgun fairly early on, the bad one anyway. The Plagas heads are introduced, primarily the scythe ones who require some distance, and the flying ones who are shotgun food but they look cool. There's a few interesting moments here and there, a fight through a market, a divided trip down 2 adjacent apartment buildings, Chris on one, Sheva on the other, which is kinda awkward if you and your partner are using Chris as the shotgun close range guy, as he's the cover character, but you know, you just deal with it, I guess. It's still a neat gameplay twist they don't utilize nearly enough. This is pretty much the first and last major asymmetrical moment. It does come up from time to time throughout the rest of the game, but never for as long a time period. The first real boss is the Ouroboros test subject. Man, they were having so much fun with the freedom they were provided. The writhing worms look good, and it looks a lot like the black fog from one of the early versions of Resi 4, which I would imagine isn't wholly a coincidence. Ouroboros is ultimately revealed to be Wesker's master plan. He wants to mutate all humans into a supreme race to end all conflict because he's a silly little guy, although Ouroboros doesn't seem to work properly, as the wormy monsters seem to be failed experiments. The boss itself is meant to be lured into the incinerator to kill it, but you can technically take it out for a valuable treasure. On a first run playing single player, almost certainly not. On co-op, where its general inability to quickly kill can be exploited with revive chains, I mean, it certainly wasn't pretty, but it worked out in the end. Chapter 2 is the docks arc. Bridges, docks, trains, a mine, the truck thing from Resi 4 again. Maybe it's just more of a leaving the city arc than a docks arc. Plenty of enemies are introduced throughout. Dogs, they're kind of a series staple. They've been in like every game. These really fat guys who I'm hesitant to call mini-bosses. They're more like mini bosses, as they're just extremely hardy melee enemies. Plagas heads that burst into little flying guys. They look kinda neat, but die to any shotgun blast. And after the bridge and port, the chainsaw's introduced. The most recurring and evil of the mini bosses. Much like the Resi 4 version, it has a solid ability to insta-kill, is even harder to kill, doesn't stay grounded as long, and can pull an admittedly funny trick where it plays dead before popping back up in a rampage mode where it just chases you around and flails. If you play Mercenaries, you'll very quickly learn why I despise chainsaws in this game, but admittedly it's an exciting return and upgrade of one of the most iconic Resident Evil 4 enemies. After defeating the chainsaw, Chris and Sheva reach a train station and get attacked by Magini on motorcycles. You do not get to fight them ever. It's very disappointing. This section also has a bunch of quick time events in single player, but multiplayer just says screw it and excludes them, which is a nice benefit of playing with a friend, I guess. I think someone realized that it would be too annoying if your friend was just bad at quick time events to not get to play or progress ever because you'd just be stuck on a cutscene. I don't know. The primary purpose of this ridiculous collection of explosions and action is to introduce Josh Stone. He trained Sheva and he's a stern but kind military guy. He's a Resident Evil side character. He opens some doors for you at a few points in the game, then leaves the plot for most of the game. It's what he was created to be. He's no Barry, but nobody really is. The train station is a pretty brisk detour. It kind of feels like they needed a good spot to put trip mines because those were an iconic part of the village in Resi 4 briefly. I'm fairly certain they don't ever appear again, or if they do, it's maybe once or twice. But the little train maze is a unique setting for the trap, and the dogs being able to run out of the trains is kind of a fun twist too, I guess. I also think that this is the first spot where Magini get ranged weapons. They get the crossbows that became a classic in Resident Evil 4 again. The transition to the mines is nice. It's one of the only dark areas in the game. They were so proud of the daytime setting for most of the game, so one character needs to hold a lantern to illuminate the path forward and enemies ahead, and one needs to shoot. The gimmick is kinda bad in co-op. It probably makes more sense when AI Sheva is doing the boring part. I also like having to go through the gate separately, where one player is left behind briefly with a handful of Magini, and the arena room. I don't really know what else to call it. It's a fun little combat stinger to the section and a fantastic map in Mercenaries. You can definitely tell the places where they're like, we need a Mercenaries map for this level, so we're gonna just stick it here. It can be the little combat set piece finale. After getting to the mining road, which itself is an okay enough level of fighting Magini on a dirty cliffside, Chris and Sheva meet Irving, an arms dealer working with Wesker. The initial BSAA investigation is launched due to his dealings, but he's a fairly minor antagonist through and through. Chris and Sheva chase him because he can lead them to Wesker, but he repeatedly sneaks away or is rescued by a mysterious cloaked figure. And by mysterious, I mean this game has like 7 major characters, so you can probably figure it out pretty quick. We can let him go for now and loop back to it when he actually does something. Popo Karimu is the big boss here. It's basically a giant bat with a scorpion tail. Popo doesn't have anything crazy going on despite the insane and frankly very cool design. His tail has a giant glowing bright red weak spot, and hitting him there hard enough or with explosives will stun him to line him up for a bunch of damage. In co-op, he has an extremely hard time doing much, as he's always facing his back to someone and only attacks at close range with the kind of attacks you would expect. In single player, I imagine he's a larger threat as you need to crouch on ordnance for stuns more, but the design makes up for what is kind of an underwhelming fight. Chapter 2 ends with something that Resident Evil 4 didn't have, but pretty much every other game of the generation did. A turret section in the back of a Hummer. Motorcycle enemies and truckloads of Magini attack the Jeep as the duo drive through a pretty relaxing savannah. It works well enough as a turret section. The overheat meter is very well tuned to keep encounters tense, but like the game's color scheme, it feels like an obligation for the era the game came out in. The slight twist on the usual format here is the Nadesu, which is... it's like a tribal-themed bearded gigante, which serves as a kind of awkward turret boss, which itself is vaguely a quick-time event boss. If he swings a pole, you literally do a quick-time event. If he goes for a stomp, you tickle his foot. When the Plagas pop out, you shoot them. The scale of the Nadesu, the detailed animations, and most everything else going around the creature is very cool, but the fight amounting to a very long and very failable quick-time event before Nadesu is never seen again is pretty disappointing. It makes it a little too clear that this boss only exists to justify the turret section in some odd way. Chapter 3 is boats and oil all the way down. The marshlands are a fairly ambitious twist on the usual, and by that I mean it's basically the Wind Waker. You're on a boat, one drives, one shoots, and need to stop at 4 islands to grab pieces of an emblem. Each one is roughly the same. The tribal enemies are introduced and become the main generic enemy for a while, their spears give them better range and act as projectiles, and they bounce up faster than standard Magini. They also have a mini-boss in the Chieftain whose mask deflects projectiles and who are kinda just huge and unsettling. They lurch around in odd ways and loom over you, although they're some of the least threatening mini-bosses given their speed and lack of insta-kills. Also, the new Plaga set is my favorite of the bunch. The Unfolded Man actually hits those body horn notes that the Plagas rarely achieved before. His slowness becomes intimidating as he can only be heard from behind, and when he does get over to you, it's over. The whole section feels great, the switch up is intense, the new enemies are fun, and raise the stakes of every battle as your weapons begin to be upgraded enough to handle the old ones, and the openness of the air is an interesting experiment. It's probably now that I should maybe address the racism thing a little bit. Back when this game came out, there was a lot of controversy over the fact that you're 2 military people shooting African people. I do think it's maybe a little reductive. Like, I understand how it's bad optics in some way, for very obvious reasons. Although, I will say, I think Africa is a very unique location that doesn't get featured in games very much. There's a lot of really interesting and just unique stuff in Africa that you could only see there. There's definitely the risk that you bump into that someone will take it the wrong way or like overthink the optics of the situation, but I think never setting a video game in Africa and never getting to introduce people to the way Africa looks and feels through that medium is kind of like a little shallow. I don't know if there's been any other major games that have been set in Africa in this way. I can definitely understand why people get touchy about it. There is a certain element of military man shoots African native people that maybe was a little poorly considered, but I don't know. If it wasn't for someone just saying like, it's not a game about that, it's a game about shooting zombies, then we'd never have a game set in all these cool African locations. The larger tribal village after feels like it was mostly designed as a mercenaries map. I mean, it literally was. It's wide open and yet closed in and compact, full of huts to hide in, ladders, and layers of platforms. Great map, kinda odd in the story, but it is fun. It also comes with this really odd little puzzle section where one player dodges crocodiles on a raft while the other player slowly cranks them over. I think if you just didn't fight enemies, there'd be some tension, but the cranker really is just left to their own devices while the other guy just does quick time events to dodge crocodiles. Like, if the enemies are dead, the guy on the crank is not in any danger. It kind of feels poorly thought out, but maybe it makes more sense if you're the kind of person who doesn't systematically kill every enemy on every map. This somehow transitions into an oil field, which I think hits a nice level of claustrophobia. All the hallways are narrow and looping, go up to higher floors that drop back down to lower floors. It's all a little disorienting. And the double chainsaws once Chris and Sheva get separated is probably the most tense moment in the entire game. Fighting one alone genuinely feels like the end of the world in ways that most of the bosses just don't. Josh briefly also joins you at the refinery, and then he's kind of just gone for most of the rest of the game until he saves you at the very end, but, you know, it was nice to see him in the last stand room where he fixes the elevator. The game really loves those last stand moments like Resi 4's little, I don't know, house set piece, where you're just fighting to stay alive against a horde for a certain amount of time, and it loves short time segments like getting to the boat here. The game is fairly desperate for tension, I think, as the game doesn't particularly challenge, especially in co-op, but admittedly, moments like this are an easy win for the game. The rest of Chapter 3 is the boat arc. The first half is a gimmicky jaunt between small arenas broken up with short turret sections. The arenas are all nice, the waterfront docks offer a ton of cover and chances to split up the characters, but it is fairly routine. The boss fight is where things get pretty dumb. Irving takes the Ouroboros and turns into a giant fish. Get it? It's like Resident Evil 4. And then you shoot him with turrets for a really long time, a really, really long time. Occasionally needs to be shot in the mouth to stop a charge, occasionally there's a quick time event. It's more of the fight against the big fish guy. They needed to justify the turrets so much that they had to make 2 entire bosses for them, I guess. I don't know what the deal was with making this also a turret thing. This one is a little less cruel than the last one, oddly enough. It's very hard to get insta-killed by the big fish, but it does feel like it goes on forever. Chapter 4 is the Underground City arc. Ancient temples and ruins. It vaguely resembles the castle in ways, but definitely feels the most distinct from anything that happens in 4. The caves are fairly dark at times, but the game likes to throw around ambient lighting from holes on the surface that lead down to these areas, so it still has that daytime energy that the game loves. And lots of spiders. They're the most monstrously obnoxious enemy in the game, even with a shotgun. We do start to get into ridiculous territory here for sure, primarily the giant underground city protected by giant mirror lasers that sweep back and forth, but they're an admittedly fun obstacle to work around, lure enemies into, and always need to be considered during a retreat. It's a great addition to the big arena. The status quo is fairly set by now. The big maze after plays with puzzles a little bit, requiring a little thinking as the staircase shifts its position around. The pyramid itself has this deadly light bouncing puzzle, which I quite like. It's very funny in co-op, even if it's not that complicated, and yeah, we're kind of at the point where things are just more the same. The pyramid just dumps you into a garden of flowers containing the progenitor virus and connects directly into Tricell's underground labs. Tricell is the new incarnation of Umbrella, if only figuratively, controlled by Wesker and Excella, the booby lady, who are working together on Ouroboros. The lab arc is characterized largely by its variety, especially in enemies. Right away, liquor betas are introduced in what's supposed to be a stealth section. They can grab you from range, but they actually end up being a relative non-issue, frequently coming in large groups that are very nice for a shotgun player, who appear during the lab and not much else. The rotating elevator set piece is cooler than it would appear. I think the slow but noticeable rotation actually puts some pressure on the aiming, which the game doesn't tend to do. And also, U8 shows up. It's like a giant scorpion thing. It looks really cool, and I like the scale, but the bosses in this game never hit quite right. It is just way too easy. Shoot the legs, feed it grenades, shoot the legs, feed it grenades. It's not the last mediocre boss either. Also, Jill isn't in the milking machine, so the hunt for her goes on. The next few areas change the game into a cover shooter briefly. I don't know what they were thinking with this one, honestly. I know that was like the popular modern thing, so they felt a need to include it, but it doesn't really fit into what this game is trying to be. Magini with guns and rocket launchers are everywhere, but there's no expectations of fighting them normally. Pretty much any wall and knee-high object can be crouched behind to survive the onslaught. It's probably the point in the game that feels the most out of place, kinda desperate to be like everyone else in the Gears of War area. Resi 4 had enemies with modern weaponry, but in those cases emphasized careful placement. Here we're just playing slow and clunky Gears, and this carries through most of the base with a brief aside to fight some roaches. The Reapers are probably the best enemy in the game. They're slow but extremely aggressive. When they stand up on their hind legs, it's an insta-kill, and they can only be harmed in their little fleshy spots. One that opens and closes on the chest, but briefly enough that hitting it with a slow power weapon like a shotgun is risky, and 2 on the back. Even with the grenade launcher or other heavy weaponry, they're extremely difficult and require taking calculated risks, and very big risks at that, to deal with. I think they're genius, some kind of evil genius, and restore the tension the game sometimes lacks 10 times over. Let's see, another Ouroboros, one you're actually meant to fight, which feels like it goes on forever, but the flamethrower is a nice little toy to deal with it over time. The big finale of the penultimate chapter is the big reveal. The plague mask guy is Jill. Yeah, I kind of figured, who else would it be? Jill is pretty off limits. You can temporarily stun her, but she's essentially a secondary element to the actual Wesker fight. Shoot him in the back when he's distracted with the other character, and don't let him get too close. If 7 minutes passes, he'll leave without dropping the reward. This exact fight more or less happens again later, but I do like the co-opiness of it this time. And the actual Jill fight, Chris needs to pin her with a QTE while Sheva shoots the mind control necklace, which leads to very funny outcomes, but it's so easy and dull 90% of the time. And with that, Jill's saved, but so sleepy EB that she tells Chris and Sheva to go finish the job. The final chapter is the Other Boat arc, a journey across a giant container ship to stop Wesker's master plan. Most of the boat is kind of the cover shooter blend again, with not a lot of twists. Sheva gets locked in a cage for a bit and just stares at the walls while Chris does stuff, which is really funny in co-op. That one feels like they didn't consider co-op at all, unlike most of the game. The boat plays out rather routinely until the bosses. In the same kind of way, the island feels like just more combat in 4. Miniguns finally show up, basically unchanged from 4, but most of the lead up is just more the same. The bosses are all an interesting bunch. Excella turns herself into a giant tree Ouroboros with 4 giant glowing weak spots that need to be cracked open, while spawning little goo creatures for resource regeneration. For some reason, the boat also has access to a satellite laser gun like the Hammer of Dawn from Gears of War, and a satellite that apparently follows it around, so every few minutes you get the big, flashy space laser spectacle when it recharges, which is admittedly the coolest thing ever. It's probably the best boss in the game for being both decently threatening and flashy. Even if it's still ultimately nothing special, like the laser's cool, and the boss can actually kill you. It's a little more aggressive than some of the other ones, but it's another big thing that stands in the background for you to shoot its giant glowing weak points. Wesker 2 is almost identical to Wesker 1, maybe a bit more aggressive, and with the classic Resi rocket launcher power trip 10 the final boss. This is the coolest fucking thing that happens in this game, and no one talks about it. And that's all with the goal of injecting him with his Ouroboros medicine to mutate him, which makes him more vulnerable, apparently, and which leads to the escape plane crashing into a volcano for a ridiculous finale. You would be dead in 30 seconds. It is 1200 degrees in there. But it is appropriately dramatic and over the top for our favorite slightly tistic supervillain. The boulder punch has become an infamous gag around this game, and it's kind of silly, but way less so than people make it sound. People describe it like it's that scene from the John Cena Scooby-Doo movie. When in reality, he just punches it a couple times and it falls over. More importantly though, Wesker is all sorts of fucked up and somehow just as underwhelming as every other boss in this game. You shoot the big red glowy weak spot, sometimes it's on his chest and sometimes it moves to his back, and you don't get too close because his tornado's an insta-kill. He kinda just meanders around slowly. He's not the aggressive nightmare Krauser was. Despite the similarities, he kinda just lets it happen to him, hits the lava, and then gets blown up with a double rocket launcher, and Africa and the world are saved. The ending is fine, but there's nothing all that much to say about it. The Wesker storyline is wrapped up and has been well and truly moved on from mostly, and Sheva and Josh never appear again. The game kinda just wraps up everything and leaves no real lingering sense of what's to come next. It feels like too much of a real finale in some way, both in the way that it's like a Revenge of the Sith level over-the-top volcano fight that goes on for way too long, and the central villain of the series is killed permanently. There's really nowhere to go from here, so they had to just start making shit up for the next one. That's why you don't usually kill your main antagonist of the overarching series. Like every game of the generation though, there was some DLC, which added in little background details that were probably meant to be in the game at some point, but were cut for, let's call it financial purposes, let's be nice. The 2 DLCs could not be any more different, with one being very much a throwback, while the other is more Resident Evil 5. Lost in Nightmares is the playable version of the Spencer Mansion flashback from the main game where Wesker and Jill go missing, and seems to exist primarily to recreate portions of the Spencer Mansion in Resident Evil 4. Fully 3D, free camera, explorable, although an Easter egg lets you experience this chapter from the classic fixed camera angles, tank controls and all. It would be easy to write Nightmares off from a glance as nostalgia bait, and at times it is, containing many of the classic locations like the dog hallway and some of the old notes, but wrapped up with new puzzles and a unique enemy. enemy. The first act of Nightmares especially is some classic Resi 1 with a co-op twist, getting passwords and keys to doors, rescuing each other from booby traps, playing the piano, getting jump scared by harmless bats in the dog hallway. It'd be nice if there were some enemies here and there, but it's a very charming return to a simpler time. The underground caves below the mansion still play with the more Resi 1 puzzles, but also introduce a new enemy type exclusive to this DLC and this DLC alone, blobs, who swing around giant anchors, usually as retaliation after getting hit with a melee attack, and need to be shot in the eye that exists on their giant tumor on their back to knock them down. Missing the eye also sprays you with poison blood that stuns and chips. This is the only enemy in this little campaign. I guess these little corpse jump scare guys too, kinda. And to their credit, the blobs are intimidating, the caves are claustrophobic, and getting behind them is risky, getting close is risky, not getting close makes them bullet sponges. The game escalates to multiple of them fairly quickly. They're a strong enough mini-boss to carry the load of combat on their backs for the entirety of the DLC. The third act forces you to confront them weaponless as Chris and Jill fall in a big hole and drop all of their weapons, I guess. The goal is to find levers to raise giant spike traps to drop on the 3 blobs, using one player as bait. It's gimmicky as hell, but tense and fun, the first time at least. I think when it comes to doing it 2 more times, it might be a little bit much. It doesn't change much either time and kinda feels like padding. The Wesker fight is kinda just a mystery. There's some invisible timer that eventually ends it, and all you really need to do is survive. You get an achievement for landing enough hits, but it's kinda anticlimactic that your only real goal is to kinda wander around and not get hit for 5-ish minutes. And given this is all expansion on a flashback from a game we'd already seen, it's like, oh yeah, I guess that's how it is. That all said, Lost in Nightmare definitely wins a lot of points on its charms alone. The recreation of the Spencer Mansion, the little jump scare moments, the fun new mini-boss, the Easter egg, classic Resi puzzles and tropes in a fully 3D game. It's Resi's first return home after it's morphed into a more action-focused series, and it feels comfortable and goofy in all the right ways. Not to mention any version of this game you can buy today comes with this DLC and the next one, so you may as well spend the extra 45 minutes it takes to beat each. Also, I fully expect to see a Resident Evil remake sometime in the nearish future, and I hope it looks as good as this game does, I'm sure it will, because Resident Evil 4 looks way better than this game, the remake, and this already looks good, so. Desperate Escape is very much the Resident Evil 5 DLC one would expect from Resident Evil 5. Following Josh and Jill as they escape the temple to get the helicopter they eventually save Chris and Sheva in. The chapter feels somewhere between an actual level and a mercenaries map. The map itself is a unique journey through what appears to be military installations on a dam or maybe like some kind of large bridge structure, and is almost entirely comprised of sections of endless enemies. While loading you so aggressively with ammunition, it's harder to find somewhere to put it all than it is to use it. And the big finale is literally sitting on a small roof fighting off hordes while waiting for a helicopter to arrive, with many of the game's mini-bosses and even the microphone man from the execution at the start of the game showing up. It's a bit of a power trip, but it's balanced out well by an overwhelming amount of enemies. But that's kinda all there is to it. Desperate Escape is fun in the moment, as Resi 5 tends to be, but it is very much a 45-minute mercenaries map with very few gimmicks or flourishes, which is a nice one-off, but it's much more skippable than the other DLC. Resident Evil 5 is a very, very derivative game of its predecessor and was never ever going to live up to it. You can go through and point at basically any moment, and it's a Michael Bay-esque parody of something Resident Evil 4 did, and it can feel a bit repetitive and identityless because of that. However, being stupid Resident Evil 4 is like 60% of the way to being Resident Evil 4, and the co-op is such a surprisingly good fit for this game. The inventory reversion should be a bummer, but the juggling between 2 players is surprisingly thoughtful and exciting. The weapon variety leads to well-defined, varied playstyles that you can mix and match with another player, and the levels have solid gimmicks and set pieces to keep driving you through the endless combat. The intense focus on action combat can be a bit iffy to some, especially the ones who just desperately need Resident Evil to be horror again, but the combat itself is great, even if we have left horror more and more, although the game does take an admirable stab at being tense throughout that combat, especially in regards to the many, many terrifying mini-bosses like the bugs, even if the atmosphere is definitely at the bottom of the priority list for about 98% of the game. You kinda just gotta take Resi 5 for what it is. Get a friend and enjoy a fast-paced, vaguely horror-themed action co-op romp. As much as it tries, Resi 5 isn't its older brother. It probably would be even better if it hadn't tried to be so much, but the places it manages to stand out, it does so quite stunningly.